is on, and then we gotta fade that like that.
Absolutely.
And we have to make sure that our video is on. And it is.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Max and Ben Save the World, a men's mental health podcast. We're glad you're here today. Without further ado, we have just got a couple disclaimers about this podcast. One is you might not agree with necessarily everything that you hear on this podcast, but we hope that you would certainly stick around to see engagement in difficult conversations. We'd love to see any comments in the chat. That's definitely a fundamental tenet of our podcast here. And then the second thing is that this podcast is not a replacement for therapy. We are therapists, but we're not giving you therapy on Twitch or YouTube or wherever you're watching this right now. Also, go to therapy. Go find psychology today. Search someone up based on your insurance. You can look for male, female therapists. Whatever you're looking for, you can certainly find there. So, yeah, miss anything?
No, I think that's it. Without further ado, Max and Ben Save the World would like to recognize Legal Eagle, the content creator on YouTube. Does an awesome job of explaining the law in really basic terms, and typically in a very nonpartisan way. He just approaches the angle of the judicial branch in a way that's really approachable to people. From what I understand, he has like a background in teaching at a university in New York, and so I think that there's some level of that of it feels kind of like a law 101 for pertinent topics, and he does like fun pop culture things as well as stuff that's really interesting and really important to our democracy today. So we highly encourage that you check out Legal Eagle on YouTube or wherever else you find educational material.
Yeah, absolutely. Sounds like a great objective thinker.
Yeah.
And without further ado, we're going to go on with our topic today, which is Dragon Ball.
Yeah.
So I think we both have a couple of different backgrounds with Dragon Ball.
Yeah.
I encountered Dragon Ball a couple years ago because I've been familiar with Dragon Ball Z since I was a boy. I grew up as a millennial. But I started watching it because I knew that it showed up in a lot of like training motivation videos as I'm an avid gym goer. And you've watched it for much longer, isn't that right?
Yeah. I watched Dragon Ball since it was on Cartoon Network at 3:30 p.m., right during the Toonami block when you got home from school in second grade. Dragon Ball has been highly influential in my life, my consumption of media. It was some of the first art that I encountered that made me want to make art, actually. Like,
that's awesome.
In elementary school, I had lots of sketchbooks and things of knockoff anime stuff, right? It would be like I'd be playing Kingdom Hearts and I would draw, basically the main character, but instead of a giant key, I'd give him a giant wrench, and felt like that was a really original idea. But Dragon Ball was one of the origins of that. I would draw the characters with additional levels of colored hair that wasn't in the show.
But this is Super Saiyan 7.
Yeah, exactly. I was very into the making your own version of.
I think there are many playground battles of no, I'm at Super Saiyan 6. No, I'm at Super Saiyan 7.
Exactly. Oh, I Kamehameha'd on the gym or on the jungle gym at recess.
Yes.
Quite a few times in my lifetime.
Yeah.
But I started with Dragon Ball Z. Cartoon Network started me.
That's an average
Dragon Ball Z.
experience, I think, for a lot of millennials.
A lot of people got, from what I understand, was the Ocean dub. I don't know for sure because I haven't really gone to look.
I don't know what the Ocean dub is. I'm watching the Funimation dub, and I've watched the whole content in the last year.
Yeah.
I just finished Dragon Ball Super recently, so I thought it would be a good time for the episode here. I think that you have a good handle on the source material for the original Dragon Ball, which I think is kind of fun to mention. I know this season we've been talking a lot about the hero's journey and the journey that men and everyone, kind of go through to become a hero and kind of do good deeds. And this is based on some, I believe it's a
Journey to the West
Chinese myth.
Yes, yeah. Chinese myth. I want to say like 400 BC, but that's probably not accurate. That could be anywhere in a couple 100 year span, but. Definitely BC story of Sun Wukong, who is this mythological figure in Chinese mythology that shows up in multiple works. Journey to the West is the most notable one in kind of like comparison to like the Odyssey, being that, the Odyssey is about Odysseus and it's how we know about a lot of myths kind of spread from there. A lot of Chinese mythology is concreted by, or at least pays a lot of irreverence to the Journey to the West story and its narrative, which is Sun Wukong is this, it's the Monkey King, and so he's this mortal being that ends up being given lots of different jobs by the gods at various times, and eventually becomes, through the wisdom of doing all of these different things and outsmarting deities at various times and absorbing a demon in many versions, from what I understand, he becomes the great sage equal to heaven. And so he's this figure that's Herculean. I think if our language, if English had evolved out of this mythology, I wouldn't have used the term Herculean. I would have used Sun Wukongen. That's how important he is to that region's mythological history.
And thinking about like my history with some of that mythology, I remember growing up, I attended a play at the Children's Theater in Minneapolis that was called The Monkey King, and they had a Sun Wukong story. And I think that also recently there was a video game that was like The Monkey
Black
King.
Myth Wukong.
Black Myth Wukong, So it's definitely not, kind of a strange. We're not a stranger to the story by any means. It's very popular, very well known,
and I think that it's inescapable. In a conversation about the cultural zeitgeist, about that story, Journey to the West, Dragon Ball Z is going to come up because it spread so much of that narrative to the rest of the world.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people that, like myself, right, that are interested in that and find out about that because they had this encounter with this other media, with Dragon Ball Z.
Yeah.
And then a curious kid like myself goes and engages with something like that. And so the power of taking some of these well-known stories and retelling them in that's palatable for an audience. I think Dragon Ball Z is among the greats when it comes to its influence in popular culture and in media.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a outside of like Pokemon. When you think of cultural imports, particularly from Japan, not even just from Japan aside, though, it's one of the biggest things we as American consumers consumed for a solid 20 years.
Yeah, it's easily one of the most successful anime of all time. What's interesting is when, I get questions about, like, do you watch anime? I say, well, I watch Pokemon. It's like, okay, what else? Well, I might watch Dragon Ball Z. Okay, that's not real anime. Because somehow Dragon Ball Z and Pokemon are, like, separate from, like, real anime, which I think is super interesting.
I think what's interesting, too, is conversations like that, I often feel like, are really similar to the conversations with basketball of who's the greatest of all time, right? And you've got Michael Jordan, and then we have a conversation about Kobe Bryant and LeBron James. That's what I think. That's what I know.
You know what I also know? I know that Bearzu is the closest to Vegeta anyone could ever get.
Exactly. Bearzu is the closest to Vegeta anyone could ever get. Speaking of which, that recent Daima clip that went viral of Vegeta was sick. Look it up if you haven't seen it.
I have not.
It's very funny. Bulma gets him to stop a fight in an interesting way. But what were we talking about?
We were talking about anime, and I actually had an interesting thought on that as we're kind of...
The big three.
Sure. Yeah.
Dragon Ball Z is the peak of the big three.
Oh, and the third one's One Piece?
That's what I was just going to ask you, is the conversation has been going around for years and years.
One Piece is so big.
I remember when the big three was Dragon Ball Z, Inuyasha, and Bleach, and that was the big three that people talked about.
I think that
that has changed.
Yeah,
right. That's changed a lot. So I'm curious, in your mind, what are the big three animes right now, and what are the actual big three animes?
To me, if you're looking at Japanese cultural imports, I would say Dragon Ball Z is huge. I think that honestly, it is impossible to beat the cultural influence of Pokemon and how. Like eclipsing. If you go to Japan, like it's Pokemon.
There's parts of our brains that are wired for Pokemon.
Yeah, there's studies about that. Yeah. Pokemon is impossible to surpass in terms of like cultural influence. It's actually made more money than any other franchise ever, like combined. Like more money than the Avengers, more money than Mickey Mouse.
That's wild.
Insane. And then the third one I would say right now is One Piece. It's just really up and coming with a lot of young people. They're really growing up on it. It's continuing to have new content, where I think that Dragon Ball Z ended recently with Super, but I suppose Daima is going on right now. But I feel like even religious watchers. Like
speaking of that, Daima actually just ended.
Oh sure,
they ended.
Forever.
Final episode of Daima aired on the 1-year anniversary of Toriyama's death.
Oh,
which
well,
I
that's
think
sweet.
was a wildly sweet thing for them to do. Yeah.
Yeah, and if for those viewers who may not know, Akira Toriyama wrote the Dragon Ball mangas and then also was involved with the anime. And he passed away last year tragically.
Yeah.
I don't know how old he was.
He was up there.
He was up there.
Yeah.
Sure, it was about time.
Yeah.
So, and the one thing I feel like we're having a really brilliant conversation on anime, but I feel like there's something to be mentioned about anime and masculinity that is already kind of coming to my mind. Where there's an assumption that if you're talking about anime, you're some kind of like you're not even a man. If you're a weeb, if you're watching Dragon Ball Z, if you're watching something else, that something is wrong with you, and that you should be doing something else, like watching something more manly. Like,
I think
like
that
Die
has-
Hard.
I think that's
You know?
shifted too, though. I think that's changed over time.
I think that there's circles in which it's probably changed. I believe you, but I think there's also circles where that's not changed. I think that there are definitely people who will judge you for watching anime.
Oh, 100%. I think there was, though, I would argue a time, probably pre-Dragon Ball Z's cultural influence in the United States. And actually, I would make that as a case for how impactful Dragon Ball Z was, is that it changed something like this.
Yeah.
My cool uncle, right? My cool uncle was, the cool uncle, he had kids later, and so, he was, for a good while, he was the cool uncle without kids, rode a motorcycle, played Dungeons and Dragons, and was, cool anyway, right? He watched Cowboy Bebop. That was one of the esoteric, cool uncle things that he did, was he was into Cowboy Bebop before, back when you had to, order VHS tapes, right?
Yeah.
Of the anime to get it. He owned Cowboy Bebop as physical media. And that was cool, right? In a hip way.
Yeah.
And I think that there's then it's anime was for kids. And I think that has not been true
the whole
about
time.
anime the whole time.
I mean, there's been blood in Dragon Ball Z even, which is supposed to be one of the more tame animes.
But I think that corporations that were distributing anime to children at the time, especially the late 90s, the early 2000s.
Oh, it's a cartoon. It's supposed to be for children.
Yeah.
Was the assumption in the
cartoons
US.
are for children. And I think
Wow.
they brought some very... Dragon Ball Z has its moments, definitely. And also, there was some other stuff, like Tenchi Muyo and Inuyasha and Yu Yu Hakusho Ghost Detective, that all had grotesque amounts of violence for an 8-year-old kid to be, glued into their eyeballs. And despite that, this was all labeled as kids stuff. And I think that there is some level of a conversation about masculinity there that clearly a bunch of people saw this material. And, we can joke that they didn't review it. They just said, screw it, let the kids watch. It's a cartoon. But a bunch of people reviewed this. And at the time, we're like, yeah, this is okay for the 8 to 12-year-old demographic. Mm-hmm. And this is what's interesting to them and what is acceptable. And I don't actually necessarily disagree. I think the reality of our world is that we live in a world with violence, and so stories with violence are going to happen.
And I also think that
fundamentally violence is important to Dragon Ball Z.
Violence sells. Too.
Violence sells.
I think that ultimately, they look at this and they see, oh, that looks really edgy. I bet some middle school boys would really love that shit.
Yeah.
And you know what? Middle school boys really love that shit.
Yeah.
They did.
Yeah. They were right? They were correct. But I do wonder what that line clearly shifts, right? I think that you look at right now. I think that since Dragon Ball Z, we had Naruto was in that big 3 conversation as well for a while.
Yeah.
Naruto has more violence and blood than Dragon Ball Z for sure. Mm-hmm. And then my experience, I have not watched all of My Hero Academia, but I think of My Hero Academia as one of those young up-and-comer ones that's kind of taken that spot of 8 to 12-year-old boys, anime with magical powers. It's the term in Japanese magazines is shonen, right? It's a shonen anime. That's not violent. Yet.
It's not as violent.
From what I understand, from what I've read, the manga goes.
I think
further,
that they have had some changing cultural norms in the modern day. I think that there's definitely a lot more pushback about violence in the media. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that it's a conversation to have about, like, is the violence in Dragon Ball Z, like, constructive, or is it not constructive? And I think that, to me, after watching all of the Dragon Ball content that's available except for Dragon Ball Daima, I think that there are examples and non-examples of violence in there, but ultimately I think that Goku is painted as a hero in many ways. Goku is the character who's a parallel with Wukong, the Monkey King. I feel like Goku is someone who inspires me in a lot of ways. But I have a very important question for you, Ben.
Yeah.
On a scale from 1 to 10, how Sigma is Goku?
How Sigma is Goku? Are we
Yes.
still saying Sigma?
Yes, we are.
I would say that Goku is straight Yark Geekin.
What does that even mean?
That's how he's turned. That's how geekin he is. He's geeked up on that training. He's geeked up on. He's geeked up on doing battles.
This is a very serious podcast.
It is a very serious podcast. I think that Goku's character is really interesting.
I think
if we're just gonna do character analysis,
I think Goku, you can't
let's
like
start.
talk
You
about
gotta
Dragon
start
Ball
with
Z
it.
without talking about Goku. We do just like the characters listed by
Yeah.
series here, but Goku is in the very first Dragon Ball series. He appears with a tail and a pole and a cloud that he rides on, which honestly sounds very much like
And he shows up with a Superman origin story.
Yeah, where he's
Boy from space.
Yeah, well,
and
they don't know he's from space
that's
until
true.
Dragon Ball Z.
Boy found in the woods.
Raised by a grandpa,
Yep.
turns out to be really strong, really wholesome, wants to save the world. And
Yep.
yeah, I mean, to me, Goku is the person who always represents, what is the right and inclusive and positive thing to do, especially throughout all of Dragon Ball. He just seems like a positive role model for everyone else. And Ben doesn't like what I said.
No, I don't dislike what you say. No, I'm processing it, and it's making me think about the fact that that's all a product of him hitting his head.
Yeah.
Those
In the
positive
plot.
traits that you're sharing, right? Eventually, right? They don't say it right away in Dragon Ball, but overall, the canon of the series explanation for why Goku is the way he is he's a Saiyan, so he's an alien that's not from Earth. And in particular, the reason that he's not like the other Saiyans is he hit his head as a child.
Because he was sent, if you're
Yep,
looking at
he was
Dragon
sent
Ball
to
Z's,
destroy.
yeah,
Yep.
Goku was sent to destroy the Earth, to conquer it or whatever. But instead, he hit his head, and so he
He ends up being
more
super nice.
docile,
Yeah.
is super nice, becomes the person that he is because he hit his head as a child,
Yeah.
which is kind of interesting.
That's an interesting message to share, but also as a narrative device, it does let the creator make this person that is, in a way that, as much as we're lamenting calling them just cartoons before, is a cartoon of this overly positive guy who has a nigh benevolent belligerence about the way that he approaches
Things.
getting better, helping other people, all of these things. And I think that stories and mythos, things like this, allow us to explore extremes like that. And so giving that narrative excuse to explore through Goku, this character of someone who is profoundly pure of heart, is a really interesting thing for us as men to explore. Looking back on these messages that were instilled in us. Now, I had a different experience with it than you, but I think that offers us some interesting perspectives for this conversation. I'm looking at this as something that I am aware impacted my perception of what's cool, of what is just, what is fair, what does a leader look like, what does a dad look like, what does a strong person look like, what is the
right
response to a bully, what is the response to all sorts of things. They were in Dragon Ball Z whether Dragon Ball Z wanted it or not, right? And I think that Akira Toriyama in Dragon Ball, and from what I understand, I've seen a few interviews from him that would suggest that this is mostly correct analysis. He was a younger man and wasn't aware of the impact that his story was going to have. And so by the time he gets to Dragon Ball Z, he's more practiced in writing his story for an audience that is impressionable.
Yeah.
And so Dragon Ball, I think as we talk about, we would be remiss if we didn't stop on the fact that there are some like dated perspectives of men and women in it. And
Goku is so naive in the original Dragon Ball that he tries to check Bulma's gender, which is
through physical examination.
I mean,
right?
is grossly inappropriate and could never be aired today unless it was something that was rated R.
And characters like Master Roshi, who is in every other way this mostly wholesome instructor figure,
but is so horny for every young woman he's ever laid eyes on that, it was his like anime character flaw, really. I mean, it's interesting because Goku does receive guidance from a lot of different people. I feel like in the original Dragon Ball he kind of alternates from person to person. He eventually meets like Roshi, and then he goes to meet Korin, and then he meets Kami, and then you get
which is very Journey to the West.
And then I feel like in Dragon Ball Z it's kind of a similar thing where there's different levels of training, and you also kind of see it in like Dragon Ball Super 2 when they meet Whis and Beerus, and then he has to go train on that world, and then at the end of Dragon Ball the movies, the Super
movies,
King
Kai in there too. He has to go to King Kai's
King Kai,
training King Kai,
training with King Kai.
Oh,
then we're training with
where he learns how to do the instant transmission that they do off screen.
That is really interesting. But yeah, he's doing some of the training with a lot of those folks. It really starts in the beginning of the Dragon Ball, kind of anime. And to me, Dragon Ball is fundamentally, in many ways, about training so that you can defend your friends. It seems.
Which I think is an interesting and I think that it comes to that as a whole, quite a lot. And I think that that's an interestingly profound concept. As I try to think, for example, of other materials that do it the way that Dragon Ball Z, Dragon Ball Super does, it's hard to come up with. I think that you have lots of stories of sticking with your friends. There's almost, it's one of those, if you've seen Dragon Ball Z, you'll know what I'm saying. And if you haven't, I cannot describe to you the significance of Goku going Super Saiyan for the first time because Krillin died for a second time and cannot be brought back by the Dragon Balls. And how absolutely insane that gesture is. That he transcended his own body's physical capabilities in that way.
Wow, it's the hero's journey again.
Yeah, it is.
He became a hero.
Gifts from a god.
Yeah, gifts because it was a legendary Super Saiyan.
Yep.
It was in the Frieza saga and Dragon Ball Z when Goku did get his Super Saiyan form for
the
first
planet
time.
Gets destroyed, and they ascend, and he does literally go to the underworld afterwards. But
he does die.
Their fight ends in this very cavernous, lava-filled underworld. It is the cycle.
It's very much
the hero's journey. We talked about it last week. Check it out.
Yeah.
Well, 2 weeks ago. Check it out on YouTube. Podcast also available other places as we get it there.
Spotify's on the list.
Spotify's coming.
We're moving towards it. But yeah, I think that Goku absolutely ascends to be a hero when he gets the Super Saiyan form there. I also think that he's enraged by Krillin's death, and I think that it's worth examining that there's kind of like a need there to do something. That need is what pushes a hero to do what he has to do. It's not even necessarily that he likes violence, but that he desires to do what is right and to defend the people that is his. And I do think that if we think about traditional roles of masculinity and protecting and providing, I think that men sometimes want to feel like they do masculine things, like protect and provide. And I will say that Dragon Ball Z notably does not have a lot of providing in it. There's not a lot of going to get the food. It does
not.
And there's even in Dragon Ball Super at the very beginning, Chi-Chi is like, you're going to go do this farm thing. And Goku's partner says he has to go farm, and get some food on the table. But he ends up getting gifted 10 million zeni by, Mr. Satan, the wealthy character for there. And then he doesn't have to worry about it anymore because he has already got so much money. But yeah, I think that the protecting aspect of masculinity is so just central in Dragon Ball Z, and I think that a lot of young men, really watched it growing up and said, "Wow, I want to be that strong, so that if the time comes, I could beat someone up."
Yeah, I think so. But I think that we can. What you make me think of there with that, he gets enraged by his friend, and what does that really say? That caused me to think about, well, it's a martial arts TV show, right?
Yeah.
And so it's going to be in the context of fighting. But when we take this narrative away and we strip away, and what is it telling us? What is it talking to us about? I'm actually reminded of, like, you know, those like videos or those stories you hear about, especially of like parents where, you know, like a car is coming at them, but they're holding on to their 3-year-old. And so adrenaline gives you an uncommon level of strength to, you know, stop that vehicle in such a way that only your legs break and your kid is fine.
Yeah.
And, you know, things like that. The stories that we have every day of an extreme adrenaline moment where somebody overcomes, you know, they lift a log off of somebody because they're about to be stuck in the woods, things like that, that I think that moment, actually, if I was to try and describe it to somebody who hasn't seen Dragon Ball Z, him becoming a Super Saiyan like that, I think is almost this romanticized narrative that, you know, young boys are watching and they're going, oh, I think that I could have it in me, that when the chips are down, when the time is right, that whether it's having to lift a log off of my friend, you know, in the woods, or it's having to stop that car, or it's do the hard thing in my relationship, or what have you, they're seeing an example of somebody being faced with hardship and overcoming.
Yeah, I mean, I think about the Dragon Ball Z motivation video that I posted on our Facebook page today, and how many times I've listened to that in the last 6 months while I'm going through a workout, and how I'm just
you're a big listen to gym motivation.
I love some gym motivation, and it definitely delivers in that regard. I also think that to an extent, the reason that anime, you know, kind of gets some flack sometimes is because if men are watching anime, it's seen as if, well, they must not be doing the other thing because they're just kind of watching, you know, that activity passively rather than actually actively going out and, you know, defending their country, or like enlisting in the army, or, you know, training in the gym, doing martial arts. That those things would be better served, you know, if you just do them rather than watch them.
I think that this argument is so funny. I feel like I've heard the variations of that since I was a kid, right? And since I was a kid, my biggest thing is, the first thing that comes to mind with that is, I loved playing sports as a kid. I still enjoy doing physical activity, participating in sports, things like that. But I loved playing football as a kid. I did not want to watch it on television once. As a kid, I had no interest in watching football, because why did I care what those people were doing on TV? I could just go outside and do it. I could go outside, and I did go into my sandbox and, you know, or my backyard, and punch and kick and pretend that I was doing all sorts of stuff. But I couldn't shoot energy beams out of my hands. I can't do that shit.
No.
Right? And so when I compare the two, I always thought it was so funny that, you know, people that, you don't play football, but you watch it every Sunday. People that, you know, watch fishing TV shows or what have you, aren't doing. Could be the same thing could be said. And so I always think that that's interesting. But that calls to mind, actually, and speaking of our last episode's roots in ancient Greek history, I forget which philosopher it was. I believe it was Socrates that said that was one of our first examples in recorded history of somebody complaining that the kids were reading books too much. They were reading fantasy, and too many made-up stories were filling their heads with jargon. And so they were becoming disrespectful to their elders.
Yes.
And so...
It's one of those quotes
these kids
that you
were
feel
losing themselves in this new stuff.
Yeah, it's one of those quotes you feel like you can read, and now I want to go find the quote. But it's one of those quotes you feel like you can read and be like, "Who said this?" And they'll be like, "Oh, that sounds like some shit my teacher, you know, what I said." And it was like Plato, Socrates. Yeah. So it's been a long time that we think about that. I will say there are definitely some purists that would probably say, like, even just, you know, watching sports is not enough. If you get too caught up in watching sports, you're not doing the activity. Yeah. I think there are some people who would go on like that. But I'm recognizing, you know, we've been taking up a lot of time talking about, you know, Goku, and I wanted to mention, you know, Vegeta for sure, because I feel like, you know, I was doing the Spartan Trifecta last year in June, and there's someone who ran by in a Dragon Ball Z, you know, a little like an outfit. It wasn't like, you know, he has the
little Saiyan armor on though.
He had the Saiyan armor, but it was a compression shirt.
Yeah,
and I said, "That's Dragon Ball Z, isn't it?" He's like, "Yep," and I'm like, "Are you the Prince of all Saiyans?" He's like, "Yes, sir."
There's a guy at my gym that has the Saiyan races, the like trident with the 2 dashes.
Oh
through
yeah,
it.
sure.
He has it tattooed on his arm.
Wow, that's
and
badass.
yeah, we had a conversation about it. I mean, it looks really good. He's got like it perfectly well done on there. But yeah, that's how much of the zeitgeist it is this a random side military symbol. You know, if I was to describe this in Star Trek terms, it would be like, you know, if I saw somebody with a symbol for the Borg tattooed on themselves, right? Like it's relevant to the lore, but like it's not that relevant. Like, wow, that's a deep cut, my guy, to get tattooed on yourself.
It looks like it's cool, but you know, not everyone's gonna recognize it as like that's the Jedi symbol or whatever.
Yeah, or the Jedi symbol, something like that, right?
Yeah. So I guess I wanted to bring up Vegeta because I feel like Vegeta is sometimes almost more popular than Goku. I think there's a lot of
Vegeta's my favorite.
Yeah, there's a lot of people who watch Dragon Ball Z and then they're like, Vegeta is my guy. And I feel like he's introduced at the very beginning of Dragon Ball Z and kind of the first saga there as, you know, the Prince of Saiyans comes down, wants to destroy the Earth because Kakarot did not. Kakarot is Goku's Saiyan name. And yeah, has an epic battle with
very
Goku.
Superman origin story with General Zod showing up and looking for Kal-El is the same story, which has been done in not one but 2 movies, by the way.
That is
as an aside, so Prince Vegeta shows up looking for Kakarot, right? Goku.
Yes. Yeah.
And Vegeta transforms throughout the series. He's a different character by the end.
And I think that a lot of people are inspired by his character development, but also in that he's steadfast in a way that Goku is not. He's a lot less naive. Where he even if you go to like
he didn't hit his head.
Yeah, there's several moments in which Vegeta like has to merge with Goku to save the world and become Gogeta or Vegito or whoever, and he objects every single time because he doesn't want to be associated with, you know, Goku, even though Goku is objectively in many ways like a lot stronger than him sometimes. But he has a content of character that I think and a stubbornness that I think a lot of guys can really relate to. I think said he's your favorite.
Yeah, I think Vegeta is my favorite. Yeah, probably bar none. Trunks is close, if not right. I'm like a Vegeta, Trunks, future Gohan missing an arm specifically. Specifically,
he's
future
like
Gohan.
One like special episode.
well, he's also from the Goku Black timeline, so he shows up more than once. He shows up more than once. One arm Gohan be in like 2 episodes. 15 minutes total of airtime. But I think the Vegeta and Goku dynamic, Vegeta being introduced in Dragon Ball Z early on and then continuing onwards, changes the overall dynamic of who are the main cast of the show. Vegeta becomes a member of the main cast in a way that
the second member of the main cast.
Yeah, seriously. Almost no one else does. Tien and Yamcha kinda
they fall off once Vegeta gets into Vegeta is the superior one.
It was almost like The Bachelor, right? The end of Dragon Ball, the early Dragon Ball Z, we had Tien, we had Yamcha, we had Krillin. We had the little floating blue cat. We had Chaozu. We had lots of potential best friend that goes on the rest of the adventure with us. And I mean, Krillin was the first best friend that goes on the adventure, right?
He dies twice.
But yeah, he dies twice, right? Krillin was that guy.
Yeah.
But when Vegeta shows up, Vegeta stays on the screen in a way that nobody else does. And I think the dynamic change there of this Goku, this character who we already talked about, he hit his head. And so in essence, is narratively this guy who was born good. Just is good by default.
You know, it's so interesting you bring up the hit your head thing because I feel like that's not something that I had even thought of coming into this episode. I was just like, Goku's just a good guy.
Yeah.
I was like, he hit his head, so he's like
default good.
Yeah, default good, but defective. Defective. Even that he's all good, and that no one is actually that good.
Yeah,
that'd be so naive. Which really is Vegeta's perspective about Goku.
Yeah,
he's frustrated that someone who's so naive can be stronger than him.
I think their dynamic, though, calls to mind that philosophical question of is it better to be born good or is it better to overcome the evil inside oneself in order to be good?
Yeah.
And I think that is found within the popularity, of these 2 characters. Is I think that people inherently decide when they're watching the show, if they end up engaging with it and they enjoy it, You come out of it preferring Goku or Vegeta for lots of different reasons. But I think that a lot of people really enjoy Vegeta's underdoggedness, right? There's some really powerful monologues, probably in some of those gym motivation videos that you're talking about, where he, almost turns to the camera and has these moments of, I live my life in this other person's shadow, and nothing ever comes my way. Today is going to be the day that I overcome it.
Yeah.
And he is, as much as they're not cartoons, he's Wile E. Coyote chasing the Roadrunner. Goku is always one step ahead of him. His friend is always better than him. But that is shown to us, in one part of Vegeta's character as well. There's more than one monologue about, I follow that guy around because it's the toughest guy I've ever seen. And the only way I'm going to get that tough is by sticking around him.
And that's what Goku sees. I feel like Goku jumps from person to person, thinking about who it is. If it's going to be Roshi, and then in Dragon Ball Super, you've got Beerus, and then after the movies, you've got Broly. I think Vegeta is pushing Goku to seek higher heights, and I think that that competition is something that is fundamental to a lot of men's identities, about who they want to be, that they want to compete with each other to try and be better. That's for some reason, if you've got your buddy working out with you and he puts 5 more pounds on the squat bar, you damn well bet you were putting 5 more pounds on the squat bar. And sometimes it gets kind of ridiculous with guys where, they're drinking at the bar and it's like, well, we have to go drink your drink. If you finish your drink, I'm getting my drink. Yep. That's just kind of what it is. Yeah. They wanted to have the last thing. I feel like that does reflect the Goku and Vegeta dynamic, and I think that the competition can sometimes become a problem where Vegeta, his disdain for Goku and the competition.
Majin Buu, when he gets the M tattooed on his forehead and he goes evil over it, right? I think that Akira Toriyama explores that concept really well, and I think that on some level that's a bit what I was getting at with in early Dragon Ball. He wasn't aware of he couldn't know the cultural impact what he was going to have. And by Dragon Ball Z, by the end of Dragon Ball Z, with the Buu saga, Vegeta becoming evil again, which, this is some... wrestling on WWE has storylines like this with heel turns and things like that. But Vegeta's innate evil, the test of his character through this otherworldly divine mean, comes and takes what was his formerly villain self and brings that back to the forefront and gives him this test of will. And we all watch. And I think when you have this dynamic where Akira Toriyama is showing us a healthy way that we can push one another, right? They don't go out drinking and see who can drink more. I think there's maybe an eating competition at one point, but I think that I know that that's actually a part of Japanese culture, and specifically because Goku is the hero of the story, he's always going to eat the most. Yes. And the healthy competition and pushing of our friends is explored in this dynamic in such a way that through fantasy and the Majin Buu saga with Vegeta turning evil again, and then through his own sheer willpower overcoming that great evil and making a choice he knocks his son out and then blows himself up. But it makes sense in context. That is literally what happens. But in context, that makes sense. He overcomes the corruption that is,
and he makes a very dramatic self-sacrifice to try and destroy Majin Buu in one of the last episodes of Dragon Ball Z there, but ends up not destroying Buu, and then Gohan has to go in. We have a whole thing. Yeah. So there's kind of that. I feel like before we get to kind of our halfway point, I do want to talk just a little bit about Gohan. I feel like there's so much there in terms of masculinity. I think that Gohan is in a unique position where he is split between kind of his mother's and his father's view for his future, where his mother, Chi-Chi, has more of Gohan is Goku's firstborn son, to be clear. Chi-Chi, the mom, feels that Gohan should study more, that he doesn't need to be a superhero, and that he can make a lot of money for the family.
He doesn't need to fight.
To be at university, he doesn't need to fight. He can be peaceful. He's not going to turn out like you, Goku, which I think is really interesting because Chi-Chi also was very much like a martial artist.
And enamored with him.
Yeah, only in the first Dragon Ball. So I think that change of character was almost like let's make a meme of moms who want boys to study.
It feels very Boomer, I hate my wife.
Yeah, it does feel Boomer, I hate my wife. I
Yeah.
like how you put that.
It feels very Boomer humor. I hate my wife. Ha 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 ha.
Ha ha. Oh,
I'm
no.
in hell for 30 years.
Because I have to study.
Well, why'd
and
you
look
fucking
books.
stay around, Larry? You know, yeah, there is some level of like she's this nagging wife, and he's this oblivious husband. They're
Who's
almost
sneaking around and trying to get
they're very
Gohan to go.
sitcom-like. Actually, I think if
It
it was
is
live
sitcom-like,
action, it
yeah.
would be honestly. Their interactions are very like Everybody Loves Raymond or King of Queens.
Yeah, it's a good point.
He eats all the time. He's never around. He's always working on weird ass side projects, and she's like doing the actual labor of maintaining the household.
Yeah,
And the conflict that comes up in between them every third episode in the sitcom is, you know, that distribution is unequal, and Dragon Ball Z just kind of like rolls with it. But I think that there are other. I think Chi-Chi's character does evolve a bit even from there. I think especially in Super, there are some examples. Well, maybe it wasn't Super; it was GT, the future moment.
Yes.
But either way, there are examples where Chi-Chi does have a little bit of, you know, to compare it to like Odysseus last episode. She's got a little bit of that Penelope in her. Like she's got a little bit of that. My husband is the strongest dude on the planet, and he saved the world multiple times. You know, every once in a while there are moments where she does kind of throw the glove down and be like, you know what? Shut up, my husband saved the world. Be nice to him. You know, which is really you know endearing and wholesome. But as far as Gohan goes, yeah, she's really portrayed as this. Well, and I'm aware that the name for the stereotype in and of itself, even though it comes from an Asian creator, is a tiger mom, right? That she's this tiger mom. She's got this
well,
like
she can be fierce is the interesting thing, where she's not exactly, you know, being within the gender stereotype, where she's fierce about her opinions and actually is quite vicious in battle. Too
as well. Yes,
I do think that Gohan experiences kind of a dilemma that I think a lot of men feel nowadays, where they're kind of pulled between like this, you know, so-called feminine influence of let's go do books or something like that, or be nice in school, and then the masculine influence of yes, we need to go train, and it's okay to fight other people as long as you're defending what's right. And I think that a lot of men feel like they have to kind of choose one or the other, that there's, you know, something wrong if you know, if you choose, you know, to fight other people or go train in the gym, somehow you can't also be a scholar. You can't also learn things. Whereas, you know, I know in ancient Greece, you know, there are a lot of instances of, you know, like Plato, you know, the scholar and the wrestler, where it was both things at once. Whereas Gohan was kind of stuck between the two. And I will say one thing I'm disappointed with in the series is that Gohan was either, you know, strong or he was bookish, and there was like, you know, you're out of style training, you know. And I will say in Dragon Ball Superhero, the last Super movie, it was revealed that Gohan was training the special beam cannon while he was also studying, which is like, okay, so he was doing some kind of training in addition to that. But I think that Gohan's, you know, like crisis there is kind of real. I think it represents what a lot of guys think about nowadays.
Yeah, I think that as well, for a significant portion of the youth that were watching Dragon Ball Z at the time that it was on TV for 8 to 12-year-olds, late 90s, early 2000s, he was also the character that was their age. And he aged with them throughout the series. You know, by the time that we got to the Cell Saga, his character is literally taller, and now it's his turn to learn how to go Super Saiyan like his dad. And then by the end of the series in the Buu Saga, he's an adult. And so my very much lived experience of watching this as it was coming out was I got to see this character that I would see traits of myself in, because it's the 8-year-old boy and I'm the 8-year-old boy, and then it's the 12-year-old boy and I'm the 12-year-old boy. And by the time I was done, by the time I'm a 13, 14-year-old boy, it's an adult man. And so I got to see this lens to the future through Gohan. Should I so choose? And I think that Dragon Ball Z inherently was kind of saying that to young men. And I think it's interesting that you bring up that point of he's always portrayed in this very dichotomous way of you can either be studying your books or you can be training the way of the fist, you know? And there wasn't really a mix in between for him there.
Well, I will say that,
but he does kind of navigate it. So.
I will almost backtrack a little bit on what I said, because Goku chooses Gohan to be the captain for, the universe is going to be destroyed unless we win this tournament, at the end of Dragon Ball Super. Goku chooses Gohan to be the team captain and plan everything, because not only does he have the strength, but he has the smarts to figure out things. So I think that there is a little bit of like warrior scholar that does come into play a little bit later. It's not to say that, but I will say that it is shown as kind of like the dichotomy, and Gohan doesn't say the line of, I want to do both. I want to be, a professor at this university, and I also want to go save the world sometimes. That is important.
I do think it's interesting too in the narrative of Gohan, if we're talking about growing up and seeing yourself in media or not. I think it's easy as an adult. One of the things that we could go into at length is fatherhood in Dragon Ball Z. And eventually we'll probably get to Piccolo before the episode is over. But Piccolo stepping in as a father figure for Gohan is very significant.
We could just go on with Piccolo now.
But we could. But just a moment. Gohan's experience with fathers actually overall, we'll get into here. But one of the significant moments where fatherhood, I think, is portrayed in Dragon Ball Z is it's easy as an adult now to look at the Cell Game saga when a teenage Gohan, a young early teens Gohan is selected by his father to be essentially the representative of. He's the ace in the hole. Yeah. He's the last ditch effort. If everybody else loses against this big bad guy and the Earth is going to be destroyed, then Gohan is who we're going to throw in. We're leaving it to the kid, and they do some magical mumbo jumbo and make the kid real good so that he's an ace in the hole. And to me, experiencing that as a kid, especially with a father who is incredibly supportive, I saw that as a father supporting his son. And I saw this through the grandiose narrative of magical beings that shoot lasers out of their hands at each other. Yeah. This example of wholesome, in a way that masculinity that was made apparent to me, that I knew that my dad would get this moment, but my mom wouldn't. And there was like this level to me of this understanding of, we see all of these studies where like children that have fathers in the home tend to have, higher levels of confidence and lower anxiety and instances of anxiety in adulthood and things like this. And part of the reason that we have an explanation for that is that dads are a bit more dangerous in general when they're as parents. And I think that Akira Toriyama found this way to take this narrative and really explore that of like, there's all sorts of stories across media and across history of, I think of a famous Reddit thread that went around for a long time, was this wholesome story about a young man who had a stepdad come into his life. And the day that he started calling him dad was the 4th of July that this stepdad bought a hand grenade and handed it to him and said, "Here, we're gonna go throw these." And he stopped calling him Chuck. He started calling him Dad from that day on. And I think that there's something in those stories and in those narratives that Dragon Ball Z is conveying with the confidence that Goku has in his son to fight somebody to death. Right? There is some level of absurdity that we can look at it with now, but as a young man, I was enamored with that particular part of Gohan's narrative.
Yeah. I can't imagine having a hand grenade in my hand.
Yeah. Me neither. No, but as somebody with like a stepdad that he calls dad, that like, that showed up with good fireworks one time, I resonated with that story. Yeah, that's for sure.
I do think that there's also a little bit of the absent fatherhood thing happening too.
Huge absent fatherhood,
especially at the beginning of Dragon Ball Z when Goku dies.
Yeah.
For like, I don't know, the first time I think it is.
Yeah.
And Piccolo kind of comes in and trains Gohan.
Yeah.
I feel like I've seen several montages of, I'm not gonna go soft on you like Goku was. The world's a very hard place, and Gohan kind of needs to learn, that the world is a hard place, which is interesting because Gohan at the very beginning of the series is seen as this very childish, very emotional young man who can't really handle, being calm or being,
he cries a lot. He's either crying or angry.
Yeah, and crying or angry, and was not like Goku was at his age. Goku was a lot more just like positive emotionality, not even necessarily stoic, but like positive emotionality or wrathful sometimes, angry or funny, if you will. I've heard that there's only two emotions that men can have: angry and funny. That's not necessarily
true. That's an interesting one. Yeah, definitely not true, but
I definitely heard that before, that are socially acceptable. But I think that Gohan becomes that a little bit more as he kind of gets older, and I do think that even though it's awful to say, like, Gohan was Gohan shouldn't have been such, a crybaby like that. I think that there is a maturation that comes from being able to control your emotions that is there.
Yeah.
And I think that you can have a healthy balance of, I'm able to move across my life without things going on, without, the obstacles really getting me down, while also, being able to experience like sadness and frustration in a meaningful way. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that there's some level of, like, in a story or in a narrative like this, like, in order to cast a wide net, right, in order to be relatable, characters have to be caricatures of concepts and ideas like that, right? And so, early in Gohan's characterization, that's kind of all he is the, he's essentially a replacement for a damsel in distress a lot. Right, there's the Raditz and the Saiyans and the Tree of Life movie. All of them have scenes where the bad guy gets his hands on Goku's kid, and then it's Goku's gotta rescue him.
Yep, that is true.
Which I just realized. I'd never thought about how similar Dragon Ball Z is. Once you get out of Dragon Ball, we kind of moved away from Journey to the West, and it really hit its own stride. It sounds like I just described a Western series to you. How many John Wayne movies are there where he reluctantly becomes a father figure for a young kid, and then the bad guy gets their hands on the kid, whether it's a young lady in True Grit or mostly young men, and he's got to go save him. Goku is John Wayne for a good portion of Dragon Ball Z.
I think that John Wayne influenced a generation of masculinity before the generation before us in many ways. And I think that Goku influenced a lot of our conceptions of masculinity.
That's true. Yeah. Speaking of fathers, though, Piccolo.
The Piccolo figure, yes.
Piccolo's an interesting character. He's got some similarities to Vegeta in that he was a villain that then becomes good. But his training of Gohan is very practical at first.
Yeah, well, Piccolo initially was one of Goku's main villains. King Piccolo was like the Demon King, as it was. And then at the end of his, life, he gave birth to Piccolo Jr., who ends up being the Piccolo that we know, who has his own villain saga it's the last saga of the original Dragon Ball. And then at the beginning of Dragon Ball Z, starts to kind of become more of a friendly. And it's not entirely clear what his motivations are at first, but it seemed to be like if I'm going to be on this planet, I'm going to, rule it. And I'm coming for you, Goku. I'm going to be like, just as strong as you. Like the competition, like knowing that he lost to Goku. There's kind of a Vegeta aspect there, but ultimately what he realizes is that, if, the world's going to be destroyed, it's not going to be very practical for him. So he decides to train Gohan, Goku's son. And it's kind of a replacement father figure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that relationship develops, and I think they really cashed that years of development in with the superhero movie. I think did a great credence to
the Piccolo Gohan. It was a Piccolo story. I was surprised.
Yeah, it was a Piccolo. It was like one more Piccolo Gohan adventure, and like, I didn't expect that. I went to it in the theater with my older brother who I watched Dragon Ball Z with, and we knew going in because we'd seen reviews of it and stuff, but like prior to hearing about it, would we ever imagine that we would get another Piccolo Gohan adventure that like doesn't feel like it's just like a Hollywood cash grab, but instead a continuation of that story
lines,
with
yeah.
like some level of completionist to this, like this guy who helped raise this young man sees him now as an adult. They have one last hurrah together where they both prove that they're still competent and capable, and all is right. And I thought that was quite interesting that they chose that instead of, I mean, Goku's been the main character for years and years and years, and then here they gave us these two side characters' story. That was fascinating.
I think that I was surprised by how much Gohan was central in the beginning of Dragon Ball Z. And honestly, I'm not terribly surprised that they made a movie about that, because I do see Dragon Ball Z as having an ensemble cast. I think that for a lot of Dragon Ball Super, Goku and Vegeta were the people.
Yeah.
I think that they were a little more even central, you know, than they were in Dragon Ball Z. And I think that, Superhero as a movie definitely got a little bit more back to the roots there.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Should we do a little poorly explained philosophy?
Yeah. I think we're coming to it late. This is going to be a long one, but
yeah, that's okay. So
this to be the halfway point, but maybe we'll rush the ending.
That's okay. I wanted to talk about the concept of the noble savage.
Yeah,
because I think that it is related to definitely what Goku is. He's a boy found in the woods who ends up kind of like saving the world and is almost entirely good by default. The concept of the noble savage is a philosophical concept that goes back as far as ancient Rome. There are philosophers that definitely talked about it as long as back then. A lot of times they're referring to barbarian tribes, what they call it as barbarian tribes in like Germany and in France, which they saw as Gaul. There were definitely, I know that you said that Charles Dickens has like this poem, about the noble savage, and there's definitely been a lot of misattributions towards like Native Americans. I think that was especially a big equivalency that was happening in medieval Europe. But if you're looking at the philosophical idea of a noble savage, it means that by default humans are good. When they were born onto this earth, they wanted to do the right thing. They're kind of innocent, obviously they're looking out for themselves, but there's not like any malintent in there. And when someone is born
there's
as
no
a baby,
maliciousness in survival.
yeah, and the argument could be, you kind of look at like a baby or a child and you go, oh, it's very noble. Very, very much like, you can't really do wrong. You can forgive kids for anything. If a kid has experienced childhood trauma, you especially go, oh, honey, you shouldn't have had to deal with those things that young. But if the kid has grown up, totally to like, 21 and they're still, kind of doing, sort of bad things, kind of like, oh, well, that's not okay now that you're old. But really, they could also be a child on the inside too. But the noble savage does say that by default, humans are inherently good. It's an optimistic view of humanity. There's definitely some movements. I know that the internet told me anarcho-primitivism is one of those, where basically saying that, the people who were, cavemen kind of had a lot of things right. They were smart. They lived well off the land. A lot of their habits were what we evolved to do, and we've kind of got away from doing some of those things. And that, those societies were in some ways, even better than our current society, despite the fact that there's a lot of things in our current society that are really amazing and really cool. There definitely are opponents. One of the more famous philosophical ones is Thomas Hobbes and his Leviathan. Basically says, he outlines the noble savage concept first, and then says that society needs a strong, centralized government to control them, otherwise it will devolve into chaos. He basically, makes the argument of the exact opposite. And there are historical records, obviously, of violence occurring in the Stone Age. So it's not like, there was actually no war, no famine, no conflict during that time in human history. I think that it's worth revisiting, because I do think that in modern society we have kind of got far away from our evolved roots. We're sitting down for an hour and doing a podcast, and a lot of times people would be walking around doing things, doing tasks for a long time.
They'd have story time around the fire.
They'd have story time around the fire. A lot more of life was like lived outdoors.
I think of this concept a lot with with regards to the number of people that we interact with in our life in general. it's one of those that, you know, I think it's inescapable. It's a component of early psychological thought, and so both of our degrees are in a psychologically related field, and so there's a component to modern psychological thought that is rooted in this idea of viewing humans as an animal through this lens of evolutionary biology that kind of essentially places us at like what is at the question of empirically or scientifically what is this pure human being as they were when evolution ended, as if evolution has stopped upon us. And when I think about that pure essence, one of the things that astounds me is there's no way we're supposed to know as many people as we know. There's, you know, people having, you know, hundreds and hundreds of friends on Facebook, and the majority of human history, a human being might know 150 people in their lifetime, and
to be able to keep up with all those people, especially to have a closeness of those relationships,
yeah.
It's no wonder sometimes people feel burned out on social obligations as adults.
Yeah, and we look at things like that too. Another one that was drawn to my attention recently, though, is the availability of one's own visage has dramatically increased.
Oh, to be on
with
Facebook?
Time. Well, no, just the invention of mirrors.
Oh, sure.
And then you accelerate that forward to cameras, and then you accelerate that forward to cameras being in your pocket. The amount that a human being looks at their own face has gone up dramatically since
that's beyond,
we would see ourselves in pool
anything.
Reflections.
There's like, you know, hunter-gatherer to agriculture, and then the Industrial Revolution, and a sedentary evolution, and the digital revolution.
But
there's so much.
You bringing this up causes me to think about some of those concepts of, you know, I think that we have to give ourselves some, I think inherently in what I'm saying, is we often forget how easy it is to forget about the grace that we should extend to ourselves.
Yeah.
For the fact that I'm a monkey. You know, I'm
We're
an ape.
Advanced monkey.
Yeah, I'm a very advanced ape that at the end of the day, sometimes, you know, apes don't have good days when it rains on their favorite tree, and like,
I mean,
man,
we have a wild nature, you
Yeah.
know, where we are wild by default. I know we had our that poem recently. We've discussed Iron John before, but I do think the Noble Savage does make us reflect on the fact that we were wild once, and that if you go into the woods for a few days, you kind of feel your brain shift so a little bit. I feel like there's a little bit less society on me, like that time I went to Yellowstone.
Who was that? Oh, it just went. It was in my brain and it went right out. It was a psychiatrist that the modern term recreation comes from him because he would prescribe going for walks in the woods. Was literally the concept of recreational activities in the modern zeitgeist. We didn't use that word prior to, like, I want to say it was like 1928 or something like that. I'm not 100% sure, but I think it's Adler. That's really sticking out in my brain.
Sure.
That we just like didn't say the word recreation as a culture, and then that it entered the cultural zeitgeist because of this guy that was doing this psychological research into how good walking in the woods was for you.
Yeah.
Which is crazy. For how much thought that we've put in since the 1920s into helping each other's brains. Some of the most fundamental advice that we can see empirical data for is, walking out in the woods is like a good idea.
I'm going to rewild is a phrase that I've heard.
Rewild. I've not heard that, but I like it.
Yes, yeah. Going to rewild yourself or be out in the woods, do something like that. Make you a little bit more like the Noble Savage. Hopefully not, a barbarian savage.
Yeah.
I guess, if that's what we're thinking of. But yeah, I think the concept of the Noble Savage is, I like it that it's an optimistic view of humanity. Obviously, there was violence in, some human cultures way back when, but I do think that it does make me just think about some of those, like anthropological roots that we share, and even some of the spiritual roots that we share back then.
It interesting to me, the concept, and especially of the concept of a pure origin for humanity, in so many ways, and in significant portions of Western history, runs counterculture. to the predominant Christian thought of original sin, that people are born flawed inherently. And it's interesting to view, like Hobbes, some of the writers of the Enlightenment, handling that and moving forward philosophically with this concept of maybe we're approaching this from the wrong way, that maybe this doctrine isn't necessarily serving us when it comes to considering the natural state of being for human beings. And I in my own individualistic journey around spirituality and philosophical thought was blown away by the idea that, to me, my individualistic born in beliefs about humanity were that humans are born naturally good. And I didn't realize until I encountered organized philosophy academically that somebody had written down words for that idea, and that wasn't like just something that people think every once in a while, that there's some traction to that concept, and that's been debated. I think it's so interesting because I think in a highly individualized society like we live in today, more and more I think people would agree with that concept.
Yeah, that people are inherently good. Yeah, I think that, so being full disclosure, I'm a bisexual pagan. I don't fit into a lot of boxes that some people say. And so when I think about my spirituality, I sometimes will think about my ancestors as one aspect of a lot of pagan practices. And so looking back at ancestors that have come before me, I am sometimes very overwhelmed at the thought of the generations upon generations of people that have sacrificed for my own well-being, not only my parents, but their parents before them, and their parents, going back so many generations that we get back to, wherever the heck we were with my ancestors in Europe, and then before that, Africa, and the sacrifices that those people made so that their children might live not only live, but live a better life than their parents had, because that is something that's actually quite clearly cross-cultural. And to me, it's clear of the noble savage. And if you ask just about anyone, even someone who's been an absent parent, if they're on their deathbed, they're probably going to be like, I wish I was more present for my kids. Is a lot of times what I understand is big regrets for people. So I know we can't spend too much time.
Speaking of people that weren't present for their kids, Goku dies like 4 times.
He does. Well,
isn't around for Gohan.
Dies protecting the world 4 times.
Yes, does die protecting the world 4 times. Isn't around for Gohan. But where do you see examples of like the noble savage in Goku?
Or I think that the noble savage is one of the first things I thought of when I saw Goku naked in the original Dragon Ball with his dick out for everyone to see, which I was like, whoa, that's there. It's in the manga
He's really this wild monkey.
He's
child.
Literally, he is a wild boy, know, and I think that, and he's very wholesome, wants to do the right thing, and so, to me, Goku was, this is the noble savage, all the way, like a noble savage story. I very much think that's there. I don't know, were there other examples of that that you had seen in Dragon Ball?
Well, I think that actually, especially as Dragon Ball goes on, there's numerous examples of indigenous cultures in this fantasy setting.
Oh, in the original one? Yes.
And beyond. Oob at the end of Dragon Ball Z is from a small village in seemingly either some part of Africa or the Indian subcontinent.
Yes.
And Akira Toriyama, I think, actually has some level of, I think it was also culturally seen in like Studio Ghibli films, this sense of like romance or wonder for the countryside and what is out west, which ironically it's based on Journey to the West, but like this uncontacted peoples are something that is still in the fantasy setting of Dragon Ball Z, which is something that's interesting in a world that's interconnected in the digital age now. That in and of itself, as a point of that there are still new peoples to meet, new foods to try for Goku to try, and things like that.
I think that is the case. I think he befriends kind of like the Native American people. I think that's positive to see, but there's also kind of like the stereotype threat that's going on there too. So
definite conversations and
that's
caveats
meaningful.
of stereotypes that we can mention when we're talking about Dragon Ball Z for sure.
And I will say that I started watching Dragon Ball because I understood it as like, this is some great gym motivation content, and I actually didn't realize how central training was going to be like to the series, and so I think that was like fantastic for me to see. Like I designed a workout for F3 where I cued led a workout for some of my fellow men in the Twin Cities, and themed it around Dragon Ball Z and ascending to different levels of Super Saiyan and doing more and more difficult movements at each thing. And so to me, it's very direct there. But I will say that
I do think that there's a double edge to that sword, though.
Yeah, I was gonna say the body image piece is.
Well, I think
hard
also
to not acknowledge.
Yes. Yeah, body image for sure. But I think on the training piece as well. I think that there is a certain level that Dragon Ball Z and other animes as well, but Dragon Ball Z especially, kind of inherently tells you that you could do enough push-ups under extra gravity that you could eventually shoot laser beams out of your hands and save the whole world. And I think that there is some level of...
I think it's hyperbole.
It is hyperbole, but I think that there's a fair moment to stop. That, you know, it's a plot point that Vegeta essentially has to kill himself.
Yeah.
Training and then bring himself back magically in order to keep going higher and higher in levels. And I think that this glorification of this work ethic that is, as I said earlier, benevolently belligerent is somewhat problematic and dangerous to be instilling into young boys unchecked without at least somebody stopping and saying, hey, I noticed that there's an awful lot of this inherent reward for just doing the drone work that's being expressed here. But
I do think that there's like a I don't take orders just like by default thing that is kind of in Dragon Ball Z, and I think that Vegeta is definitely not one to take bullshit. I think that Goku is a little bit more naive, but also is curious. Like I think that like in the Goku Black saga and Dragon Ball Super, Goku isn't necessarily just like I have to train more to defeat Goku Black. There's an inquisitiveness and like some detective work that goes on there too. I also think that in the hyperbolic time chamber, where they go in and they train for a year, but it's been a week thing or a day, where Goku and Gohan have an exchange, and Goku talks about like the importance of rest to Gohan, and so I think that there are some examples of that
That's
that
a good
are
point.
in there that aren't like non-existent. But I do think that there's something to be said about I mean. You can't actually work forever. And I think if you just watch an average episode of Dragon Ball Z, it's definitely telling you, work is sort of the way. And I do think that Dragon Ball is very unique in that it's a masculine, it's a masculine show. It's very much like it's an examination of masculinity in many different ways. I do think that the body image piece does get to be real where...
Yeah, really unrealistic standards for men's bodies.
There's a lot of guys nowadays who see Chris Hemsworth in Marvel and are just like, I'm just taking steroids now. And I think that TRT is something that a lot of guys are investigating, because they're not having quality of life, and testosterone levels have plummeted worldwide due to things like microplastics and other like endocrine disrupting chemicals. But at the same time, like there's like this expectation that everyone's going to be like super jacked. And you'll even ask a lot of folks like, oh, I just want to look like I work out a little bit, kind of like Tobey Maguire in Spider-Man, and you don't really understand how many workouts that really took to get a physique like that. So I do think that Dragon Ball Z is one of those kind of initial like, man, this is an over dramatic cartoon body image situation for guys.
It enters in the annals of history as one of the major high points, like He-Man before it, where unrealistic body expectations are placed before young men at a very influential age in their formative years, where they're gathering information about what kind of men they want to be when they grow up.
Yeah, and I will say that I do struggle with that a little bit, because I am a gym goer, and I really truly believe in healthy habits and
Sure.
how that can affect someone's life positively. Because I was a nerd growing up, and I didn't go to the gym. I didn't think I belonged in the gym because I was such a nerd. But when I was 25, I taught myself bench, squat, and deadlift, and I haven't looked back because it was so meaningful to me, and it made me feel so much better about myself. And so I do think that there's a lot of positives to training, and I think that I look at Dragon Ball Z and I'm like, I do want to be super buff like Goku, but I also think that I'm self-aware enough where I don't fall into the trap of I have to be as big as Broly. Like I'm not at that level. Like I know that that's not it, but at the same time, like a desire to have kind of like the physique and the size, and it's motivational for me, but it's not like demotivational. I think that it's important for viewers to be able to discern, what's motivational, what's demotivational for you.
Yeah.
So
100%. And I will say though, as a kid that was watching it, right? Of the like kids that I grew up with, that like grew, who grew up to be, who said I'm gonna look like Goku when I grew up, the kid that you would have thought was like super obsessed with Dragon Ball Z and was like, I'm gonna be Goku when I grew up, that I grew up with, Josh. If you ever see this, I'm talking about you. He got it. He did the physique. He's done it. The like guy that was the biggest into Dragon Ball Z and wanted to be Goku when he grew up in second grade, that I was in second grade with, is one of the most physically fit men that I know of. So there might be something
I hope
to
I'm
the
a
message.
close second.
Yeah, absolutely. You're up there. You're up there.
Yeah, I got a little Vegeta in me there.
Yeah, a little bit.
So I guess one of our final notes here, as we kind of reach conclusions, Goku does achieve apotheosis, which is a word that I've become obsessed with over the last year. Achieving godhood after achieving herodom, I think, is something that's sometimes seen in like Greek myths. I know that Julius Caesar got his own cult.
Odysseus
in
never
ancient
has
Rome.
his apotheosis.
Yeah, Odysseus doesn't necessarily have an
He
apotheosis.
doesn't become a god.
But Goku does. If you look
Yes.
at the Battle of the Gods,
Yes.
Goku becomes a Super Saiyan God where he obtains that power, and then later in Dragon Ball Super he masters Ultra Instinct, which is something that only very few gods have ever mastered.
Which I think is really interesting. It didn't occur to me until we were having the conversation the show before the show. I hadn't really connected how much that really brought it back to the great sage equal to heaven that Sun Wukong becomes at the end of Journey to the West. That eventually the story of Goku kind of does come full circle back to Journey to the West, where Journey to the West is about this monkey king that goes on to do a bunch of jobs that the gods can and can't do, that eventually makes him viewed in the same regard as them. And Goku has all of these adventures that eventually culminate in him reaching this divine status, which I think is very interesting.
I think it is interesting. I think that if you're on a hero's journey for long enough, you kind of look at the original Dragon Ball. It's like, okay, you did the hero's journey. Okay, now you're doing the hero's journey as an adult. There's aliens involved in Dragon Ball Z. And then you look at Dragon Ball GT, and there's, I think, some missteps there that made it not as popular of a series. But I think that if you're just continuing training, ultimately, you eventually get to godhood. And I think that Akira Toriyama kind of saw that and was just like, okay, we just got to do that because fighting gods is epic and exciting.
Yeah. Well, it always had to escalate. I think that's one of the memes of Dragon Ball Z, is that every threat was a bigger threat to Earth. It was always bigger. Which,
well, and I don't know.
going all the way back to narratives like Flash Gordon for young boys, it's always the Earth is being destroyed. Action Comics, 1923, Superman. Every month, the Earth was getting destroyed. It's always got to escalate like that. I think that there's profundity in Goku's training paying off in such a way. I do think it's interesting that they don't explore nearly as much. I mean, it's kind of played for laughs, like Krillin and Yamcha and Tien are other individuals that used to train at the same level as Goku and who seemingly didn't stop training but don't become gods.
Because they're just not, cut from the same cloth as
Exactly.
Goku. They're not Saiyans. They're not special in that way. How many guys do you know with just ridiculous... Some goal is always on the horizon for them.
Yeah.
There's a lot of guys like that.
Yeah.
That I know. So, I will say... that's kind of our conclusions for the day, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. You want to take us out with a quote that I think is I think your quote that you prepared for today is very poignant for what we were just talking about.
I think it is relevant. This is a quote that I sometimes identify with, and sometimes I go, at. I think that in my heart, I identify with it more. In my head goes, okay, just have to think about this sometimes. It is a shame for a man to grow old without knowing the strength and beauty of which his body is capable. Ben, I guess when I read that, I always am like, yeah, that's so badass. And I think that everyone should know how it feels to be physically fit, and that is so good. But I guess, what's your reaction to me reading that quote?
I think that I immediately think of that. I feel like this text was attached to an image of a statue of a guy sculpting his like previous body into himself, with that, and so I think of that image right away. But I also think, to me, the quote is interesting because I see it in that context a lot, and I think that there's some profundity to it. I think that he's also he is trying to say that there's something noble. He's using academic language to say there's something noble about the pursuit of physical greatness.
Yeah. And
I also wonder about it. I guess I'm assuming a bit that he probably said it when he was older in age. And I wonder too about that, how important that perspective was of how old the person is that's saying this, of whether or not there's somebody that is before the strongest that they'll ever be, or if they are after the strongest that they ever were.
Yeah, I think
that there might be something that's being said, if I can think empathetically about being in an older man's shoes who knows that he's not as strong as he once was.
The washed-up athlete.
Yeah, the washed-up athlete, whatever. I think that there's something that he might be saying as well about that he's saying something about that moment, or being present and aware in that season of your life that you are in that season, and stopping and smelling the roses, metaphorically, of, wow, I'm at the peak physical condition of myself. And I think that he is lamenting. It's a travesty that, if a man goes throughout his whole life without ever attempting to do that.
Yeah.
To measure himself.
It's a shame that way. I also think that the shame word does make me get stuck, because I know that there are definitely guys who are like, I'm not going to work out. That's not who I am. I'm not about that. Working out is a chore. To me, the quote can also be about achieving a level of competence where you have achieved something, and that there's strength in, your mind, and there's beauty in the ways that you use your mind, or other skills that you might have. And so I think there is something uniquely masculine about developing a competence that way, that is strength or something else. And I mean, we could philosophically, ask the question about, are men supposed to be physically strong? Is that something that's necessary, in every single instance of man? Do a lot of men feel better if they do? Yeah. Do other men, are they not so into that? No, they're not. And I think that, from a humanist perspective, people create kind of their own meaning. I think that men, kind of have their own choice of how they want to be a man.
Yeah. You have a choice of how you want to be a man. So go out in the world and do some good.
Absolutely. Go be like Goku.